Well, what do genetic race differences imply? Chapters 8 to 10 get down to important cases, deploying accepted norms of justice, self-defense, reciprocity, and individual liberty in connection with racial preferences, crime, civil rights, and the use of race in judging individuals. Chapter 8 maintains that whites owe blacks no compensation in any form because the limitations of blacks are byproducts of genetic differences, not injuries done by whites. It insists that virtually all arguments for preference are at bottom compensatory, which is why criticisms of affirmative action that do not engage the causes of race differences invariably miss the point. Chapter 9 maintains that fear of black crime is rational, that ordinary standards permit private race-conscious avoidance of black crime, and that race-conscious measures by the state in the exercise of its police function are also acceptable in principle. Chapter 10 argues that attention to race is consistent with treating people as individuals. Sorting people is inevitable, I say. What matters is sorting them correctly. Some classification by race is warranted, for example, by the correlation of race with crime. Other classifications, such as those assumed by compensatory racial preference, are unwarranted. But racial categorizing is not objectionable per se, nor need it violate the principle embodied in the 14th Amendment that people should be treated as equals. This principle means only that differential treatment must be justified by some relevant trait, and, for many private and perhaps some public purposes, race is relevant. While races are groups, membership in a race is a trait of individuals. It is for me to decide how much risk I want to take. Statistics are a very good way of measuring risk. If there is one group of people who commits one crime per 100 people, and another group of people who commit 2 crimes per 100 people, that might seem like a small difference to some people, and it might seem like a large difference to others. I mean, it is double. You could look at it as double, or you could look at it as just one more. But I have the right to decide whether that's too much risk for me. And it's not an asshole move to say, yeah, I can live with 1 out of 100, but 2 out of 100? Yeah, I don't want to be around people who are committing crime at that high rate. I conclude that anti-discrimination laws violate versions of the Golden Rule and freedom of association widely accepted in non-racial contexts. Others, lots of names here, defend a similar position. I add specifically that, by ordinary standards, the desire of whites to refuse voluntary association with blacks is often reasonable. It is well to scout at the outset 2 common errors about group differences, each the overestimation of a statistical cliché. One cliché runs that group differences permit overlap, that, for example, not all blacks are less intelligent than all whites. Yeah, we know. This is, of course, so. Mean differences allow exceptions and decree nothing about specific individuals. However, mean group differences do support conclusions about the aggregate characteristics of groups and the likely characteristics of individuals. The fact that women are on average a half foot shorter than men allows some women to be taller than most men, but it rules out an all-female NBA team, and it makes it rational to bet that the next woman you meet will be shorter than the next man. A second oversold cliché is that variation within groups typically far exceeds the difference between their means. Again, this is indisputable. The gap between the brightest and dullest white is much greater than that between the average white and the average black. But once again, this does not vitiate between group differences. Within sex variation in height is about 4 feet, an order of magnitude greater than the 6-inch difference between the average man and average woman. Yet this 6 inches difference still explains why tall women are extremely rare. Likewise, the fact that the 15-point mean difference in IQ between blacks and whites is less than the 100-point spread between the brightest and dullest whites still permits the 15-point gap to carry important consequences, such as the relative scarcity of black scientists. For the same reason, the fact that there is more genetic diversity among Africans than between Africans and non-Africans does not render a comparison of African to non-African means senseless. Quote, senseless, as someone described it. There is much more diversity of height among dogs than among giraffes, but it is quite sensible to observe that dogs are typically shorter than giraffes. My conclusions may sound cheerless, although a more positive word is sobering. To clarify just what attitude is appropriate, I ask you, the reader, to imagine that you are the President of the United States, keen to do something about the race problem, but unsure how. In a week, you are to give your recommendations to the nation. I have tried to write the book you would want to read. The afterword is the speech you might be led to give. I should say a word about what drew me to the topic of race, and the overall question of motives. In part, my interest is a purely intellectual response to the challenge of clarifying such notions as innate, natural, and genetic. Few problems are as intriguing as how we humans got the way we are, and what light human differences shed on evolution. Like many professional philosophers, I am drawn to the conceptual foundations of these questions. A more immediate concern has been affirmative action, which began just after my own academic career did. Since the early 1970s, I have been aware of white male associates unable to get positions because of their race and sex. From the first, I sensed something amiss, but had trouble formulating what that something was. I gave some thought to compensatory justice, and knew of Arthur Jensen's work on race differences, yet I did not put them together for many years. In 1982, I managed to review Jensen's Straight Talk About Mental Tests and Gould's The Mismeasure of Man, without fully connecting race differences in intelligence to the redress rationale for affirmative action. It took me so long to see the obvious connection, and others still miss it, I believe, because of a distraction by the red herrings that litter discussions of race. Repeated warnings against consequences that race differences do not have obscure the consequences they do. Consider this characteristic volley from Lewontin, quote, "But suppose the difference between the black and the white IQ distributions were completely genetic. What program for social action flows from that fact? Should all black children be given a different education from all white children, even the 11% who are better than the average white child? Should all black men be unskilled laborers, and all black women clean other women's houses?" No one is saying that. Talk about a straw man. Wow. A constant need to fend off attributions of idiocy, here that all black women should be domestics, draws attention away from more serious reasons that race differences might be important. Having to contend with an army of straw men deflects one's concentration. That opposition to hereditarianism is associated with the political left may suggest that I stand on the right. Understood as the view that democratic liberties are a facade for oppression, leftism does indeed strike me as absurd. Yet on matters of race, the orthodoxy of the right is no more enlightened than that of the left, and in some ways less coherent. The left holds that blacks would do as well as whites, but for racism, while the right holds that blacks would do as well as whites, but for well-meaning government policies like welfare that sap black ambition. The seductions of popular culture are also sometimes added. The left's theory may be wrong, but it observes the form of correct reasoning. It tries to deal with conflicting evidence, positing unconscious structural discrimination to explain black failure in the United States after the passage of civil rights measures, and internalizing of the white man's image of blacks to explain the decline of post-colonial Africa. On the other hand, while conservatives have made a strong case that welfare has accelerated black crime, poverty, and illegitimacy, they ignore the fact of whites to respond as blacks do to welfare incentives available to both races, and explain black failure in the post-civil rights era as a legacy of slavery in language borrowed from the left. Conservatives, such as Thomas Sowell, aware of the worldwide failure of black cultures to develop European and Asian levels of technology, circularly attributes this failure to black culture. I like Thomas Sowell. He has some very good insights. But yeah, when it comes to this, since he's black, I think it's understandable for him to have a bit of a blind spot. And yeah, he basically says, black culture sucks because black culture sucks. Which isn't really an explanation. If you have two brain cells, you can see that. But at least he doesn't say, it's Whitey's fault. Man. Does that make him an Uncle Tom? Left and right tend to share four premises. One, of course, is that the racial differences are caused by forces external to the races themselves. Racism for the left, government intrusion for the right. A second is impatience with quantitative reasoning. Prior to inquiry, it is natural to ascribe the black-white attainment gap to a number of causes, including genes, environmental correlates of genes, discrimination, and historical accidents. The substantive issue is how much each factor contributes. Yet both sides cast the debate in all or nothing terms. It is all oppression or all welfare, with nothing in between. No genes in betweens. Some single factor or cluster of factors may well explain the entire race gap, but the question whether one factor dominates must be asked before it can be answered. Incidentally, the all or nothing mindset can coexist with extensive use of descriptive statistics. Hacker, for instance, presents pages of quantitative data on race differences in residential patterns, crime, income, reproductive trends, and academic success, but goes on, without any causal analysis, to attribute these differences entirely to white racism. A preoccupation with blame leads both the left and the right to conflate questions of cause with questions of fault. The causal question is simply, why do the races differ? The complex fault question is, what malice or folly created these differences? Finally, both left and right see the failure of blacks to live like whites as a problem. Certainly, blacks are less prosperous than whites, but this relative shortfall does not imply that blacks are deprived in any absolute sense. A black with a TV set and a flush toilet has treasures undreamed of by the pharaohs. Should the black-white discrepancy be an expression of more basic biological differences, it is not clear why anything must be done about it. After all, it is not a problem that owls live in trees while gophers dwell underground, unless an owl is forced to live in a burrow. Consider the black-white difference in infant mortality, cited by Janes and Williams, as a paradigm consequence of preventable social conditions. Should this difference be a biological phenomenon, as recent research suggests, it is no more a social evil than is the susceptibility of Jews to Tay-Sachs disease. Humanitarian reasons would remain for trying to save more black babies, but the majority could no longer be held responsible for causing black infant mortality, or negligent in permitting it. To be sure, biological differences can create problems. Compare the underground owl. Behavior evolved in Africa may be maladaptive in urban societies created by Caucasians, making life in white society a problem for blacks, and the frequent conflict between black behavior and white norms a problem for everyone. But sheer differences in prosperity are not in themselves bad. I'm not sure if that's really true, because if there's a large wealth gap, that's obviously going to breed envy. So it is kind of bad. To be sure, blame laying has its comforts. One can try to improve a bad situation caused by bad deeds by attacking the culprits, an option not available absent culprits. Racial conflict due to discrimination can be treated by suppressing discriminators. Conflict not stemming from discrimination is to that extent less tractable, hence, paradoxically, more alarming. So basically, simple-minded people want simple solutions. But there is no simple solution to genetic differences. What do we do about it? Can't just change the genes, can we? It's not like changing a pair of Levi jeans for a pair of Wranglers. Talk of blame and evil leads inescapably to the Newtsies. I'm going to say Newtsie and Hler, because I think those words might be bad words for JTube. Talk of blame and evil leads inescapably to the Newtsies, and whether the views expressed here resemble Uncle H's, Mr. Hler. Strenuous denial would only... Oh, and by the way, this is a bluish guy speaking, a bluish guy writing this book, if you know what I mean. So to call him a Newtsie, kind of funny. Strenuous denial would only strengthen the suspicion that there is something to deny, but one decisive point should be made. Nothing that Hler believed or did has any logical bearing on any issue of substance. That a bad man believed races differ does not mean that all races are the same. That his actions were caused by this belief does not make those actions its corollaries. Physics has allowed the development of weapons, but that does not falsify physics, nor are the monstrous uses to which these weapons have been put implicit in the discoveries that made them possible. I'm sure Hler believed that 2 + 2 is 4. Does that mean we should stop believing that? Or that we should not use that information or apply it in any way? Hler believed genes are different, so anyone else who believes that must be like him. Real logical. Invocation of Hler is one of many ways in which discussions of race are warped into battles between good and evil. That's not what this is. I'm just trying to understand reality here. I don't have evil motivations. I don't want to hurt anybody. And neither does any sane racist. We're just trying to explain why things are the way they are and not be blamed for things that aren't our fault. Let's see. Invocation of Hler is one of the many ways in which discussions of race are warped into battles between good and evil. Another is the contrast between sympathy for the underdog, the decent motive driving many environmentalists, with hereditarian meanness. I'm a big meanie. Why you gotta be so mean? If you think I'm mean, you're an idiot. And I don't really care what you think, because idiots are wrong all the time. Is that too mean? Oops, sorry. Still another is the counsel that genetic race differences should be denied, whether they exist or not, because focusing on nature breeds fatalism, while focusing on nurture encourages social reform. So basically, people prefer pretending that it's all environmental factors, because then there's something that they can do about it. It gives them a sense of comfort and hope. Understandable, but misguided. Mostly misguided. Blacks have a practical interest in environmentalism inasmuch as it justifies racial preferences. and a psychological interest in it insofar as it explains away failure. As for harm, telling blacks that their estate is due to oppression rather than lack of ability can only stoke resentment, which, by the way, is why they steal so much. Think about it. They want their reparations, man, and they ain't getting them, so they gonna take them. Sorry, Walgreens. Sorry, CVS. Sorry, anybody with a bicycle, any white person with a bicycle. You got to give me that because of racism, because of slavery. Don't even pretend that that is not what is going through many, many, many black brains when they decide to steal stuff. They're just getting what's coming to them. They think it's compensatory. You know I'm right. Furthermore, blaming crime, black or white, on oppression weakens society's will to restrain it and hands criminals the rationalization that they are entitled to the possessions of others that they covet. Which is basically what I just said. Calling talk of race differences an excuse for perpetuating inequity begs the question: black poverty and educational failure are inequities only if the races do not differ. Should biological race differences exist, the arrangements complained of may be equitable after all. First deciding what is equitable and then attacking extant social arrangements on those grounds puts the cart before the horse. The proper course is to examine the facts first, then, by their lights, assess the state of society. To this examination we now turn. So that's the end of chapter 1, and there are a couple of footnotes here that I wanted to read. There are 15 altogether, but I'm just going to read 2. Footnote number 10. When I mentioned race differences in intelligence in print, responses included death threats, feces in the mail, arson, telephone harassment, and efforts by my college to revoke tenure, which necessitated a federal lawsuit. Other academics who have publicly urged a role for genes in behavior, such as Jensen, Rushton, and E.O. Wilson, report similar and often less pleasant experiences. Rushton has been investigated by the Canadian government for dissemination of hate literature. Sounds like Ernst Zundel. I don't know if you ever heard of him. Look him up. ERNSTZUNDEL. Hate literature, punishable by 2 years imprisonment. Wow. And footnote number 12. Nozick, that's the author's name, currently believes freedom of association should be limited by the need to express social solidarity, and would apparently endorse a ban on speech that is, quote, offensive to blacks, Jews, homosexuals, Armenians, Asians, and American Indians. All groups, quote, membership in which is part of their self-conception, end quote. So I guess membership in a white ethnicity is not part of anybody's self-conception. Kind of a arbitrary group there, or group of groups. What about Indians? What about Japanese? What a stupid thing to say. Well, on that note, the people who disagree with us are stupid. As if we didn't already know this. Convincing them that they're stupid is a monumental task that will probably never be achieved because they're too stupid to know how stupid they are. I'll see you in chapter 3 probably. I think I'm going to skip 2 altogether. Peace.